I'm Sherry Booth, and I'm looking at my notes, forgive me. I'm the Senior Development Officer here at Trent, and my role is I assist people who want to help the university by making donations, either immediately or in their wills and so forth. So my role involves a little bit of estate planning. Another hat I wear is I'm the incoming president for the Peterborough Estate Planning Council, and that's where Peter and I know each other from. And I was kind of excited about this workshop. I've been excited about this workshop. Peter and I have done it together before. He does the presenting, I just do the introducing. But cottages are so much fun. On the weekend, I had the pleasure of being out at the Booth family cottage, and I had my in-laws here. We were at the cottage, and the kids were all playing in the water and screaming because it was so cold, and it was so much fun. And when you do this workshop, it becomes painfully aware that you want to hold those memories. That's what we want to make sure that we preserve, and we're able to pass it on to the next generation. My family has a cottage in the Pontiac region at Quebec, and I have a family of 3, being my sister, my brother, myself. And on the Booth side, the Booths have 4 boys. So everybody's got a different plan on what that succession should look like. Everything's different depending on your family situation. And we'll all have our own issues depending on how that succession happens. And Peter today is going to help us, walk us through all those conundrums, as he calls it. Peter practiced law in Peterborough. We've got a lot of Peterborough people here, mostly. Out of town? Great, well, welcome. Peter's worked in law in Peterborough for the past 30 years. He is what I consider the expert on cottage succession and estate planning.
Thanks.
It's such a complex issue. You think you know what some of the pitfalls are, but when you have the presentation today, you'll go, there were a lot of pitfalls, and do they all apply to me or maybe not? Peter has written articles for Cottage Life magazine. You may have seen them. Also in Good Times magazine. He's frequently quoted as a resource, Globe and Mail, the National Post. He's frequently a featured speaker for the Federation of Ontario Cottagers Association, as well as frequently since 2006, so quite regularly, annually, he speaks at the Cottage Life Spring Cottage Show. He also, because he's not busy enough being a lawyer and all those things, he also has he works with the local Cogeco TV show and runs an estate planning series on there as well. So I'm going to stop now and welcome Peter and welcome you.
Thanks, Sherry. And thanks for coming out on such a lovely evening. You never know if it's pouring rain to go, people won't come because it's miserable weather. When it's gorgeous weather, they think, oh, Jesus, a lot better places to be than inside. I wanted to first pick up on a couple of things that Sherry said, particularly about the complexity of cottage succession, and that is true. It is very complex. I do a lot of estate planning for a lot of people, and cottages are one of the most nuanced and sophisticated things because it's not just sort of the financial side. Well, I have an investment portfolio and I don't know what, some of it can be liquidated if need be to pay capital gains taxes, but we really don't want to sell the cottage to come up with capital gains taxes. We'd rather keep it for the next generation. But the good news is that for every problem, there is not just one solution, there are several solutions. And so the interesting part for me about the cottage succession planning is every family is unique and every cottage is unique. Now, yes, they confront the same issues of how we're going to deal with capital gains taxes and if there's going to be multiple ownership, if we have more than one child, how are they going to cope together? But every family presents its own unique issues, and we can actually have quite a narrowly tailored succession plan for each family. So there are answers to them. The first probably part of my presentation is going to be highlighting what some of the challenges are, and then I'm going to get into the solutions. So don't give up halfway through. And I'm certainly most of the fun for this is the question and answer. So what I propose to do is to go through the presentation here, and then, frankly, I'll stay as long as you guys want for the question and answer. So there's sort of an outline of what's going to happen. A couple of things. Again, Sherry was touching the emotional basis of how special cottages are, how important they are for the families. And two things I would like to say to you. I had a very motivated client, I guess just probably at the end of last year, a grandmother. And she was determined that, you know, by all means of everything, that it was going to be the cottage. Said, you know, you got a lot of asset value here tied up in your cottage, and you know, you told me your mother lived to be 98, and you know, what if you have to sell the cottage? Oh no, that wasn't even going to be heard. And so when I was drilling down into this, what she pointed out, and I'm sure many of you would be aware as well, if we're successful in keeping the cottage in the family, the benefits is more than, you know, just having access to the lake and that type of thing. For her, she says, this is the time I get to see my grandchildren. Sure, I might see them on birthdays, or you know, they might, you know, come to visit me, but basically where I get to see and bond and live and enjoy my grandchildren is at the cottage. And if the cottage wasn't here, that probably wouldn't happen. And then she said, and this was the part that I thought was really quite telling, it's the only way the cousins get to know each other. Because she's got family in Windsor, and she's got family in Quebec, and she's got family in Toronto, and you know, the kids get along together, and they might see each other briefly at Christmas, and it's a big circus, but quality time when the cousins get to know each other is at the cottage. And then that's laying the foundation for the next generation of cottage ownership. So that's the fun part. The other part that you need to be aware of is, I hardly need to tell this crowd who are so motivated they'll come on a lovely Thursday evening to talk about cottage succession, but really how important it is to get this right. The reality is, for almost everybody in this room, that the cottage that you now have is probably the only cottage that's ever going to be in the family. How many of you think that your grandchildren are going to be able to, if you've got 4 grandchildren, that they're all going to go out and buy cottages? No, they're not going to. So the cottage that's there now is probably the only cottage that there's going to be. And if somehow we let it slip through our grasp, the cottage will still be there, but it'll be another family's cottage, and it'll be their memories, and it'll be their cousins and things that grow up there. So there's why cottage planning is so important. If we don't get it right, if we screw it up in some way, if it's sold because of capital gains taxes, if we don't have it organized so that the children have a structure in which to share ownership and usage and responsibilities, we probably don't get a second kick at the cat, and that's true for the grandchildren and great-grandchildren. So let's talk about it then. So I've been doing this quite a while. I sort of know how to do it now. And so I was challenged, well, you're so smart, tell us how to do it. Well, okay, I'll tell you. Here are the 6 steps to what I call a successful cottage succession. Of course, the devil's in the details, but the first step is actually retaining the cottage by the parents until it's time for succession. That's more of a challenge than you think, or for some people it's more of a challenge than you think. Most people acquire a cottage, whether it's through inheritance or whether it's buying it. You know, they may be in their 30s, they may be in their 40s, they may be in their 50s, they have good employment, maybe there's a couple of jobs. How easy is it to keep 2 residential properties going? You know, how expensive is it? And what you can do in your 40s and 50s and 60s and into your 70s, where the income is there and the ability to get up onto the roof in the middle of winter to shovel off the snow so there isn't too much load. Those are sort of doable things. But now we are living into our 80s and into our 90s, and so it becomes increasingly difficult to cope with the financial issues as well as the physical responsibilities of looking at the cottage. So I have lots of people, there wouldn't be a month that goes by where I don't have people in my office doing planning, saying we love the cottage, we'd like to keep the cottage, we just don't know if we're going to be able to keep the cottage, you know, and if we have to, because we've got a house that's worth $300,000 or $400,000. We've got a cottage that's worth $300,000 or $400,000. Most of our assets are locked up in non-income producing real estate, and we love them both. But I tell you, if push comes to shove, it's going to be the house where we sleep that we're going to have to keep, and not the cottage, unless we can find an alternative. So retaining the cottage retaining the cottage by the parents until it's time to pass it on is an important first step. The second one is managing the capital gains taxes upon succession. I think everybody here is pretty familiar with capital gains. I think at some point in my presentation I give a little illustration of how it works. But that is the elephant in the room when it comes to cottage succession. It's not like the good old days in the late 70s when the husband could have the house in his name and the wife could have the cottage in her name, and each one of them had a principal residence exemption and off to the races. Well, that was taken away from us rather annoyingly in 1981, and so spouses can just have one principal residence between them. Now, there's actually tons of cool stuff that we can do with the principal residence exemption. It's a far more flexible thing than you think of. There were a few bones that were thrown back to us when they took the two away from husband and wife. There's a lot more flexibility of, if the house went up in value in the late 80s more than the cottage, we can call that the principal residence for that period of time. And then the cottages were sort of in the doldrums until 94 or 95, but after that, and consistently since then for the last 20 years basically, they've been probably going up far more than the house. Well, then we can literally shift the principal residence card over to the cottage for those periods of time. Lots of cool stuff we can do with principal residence exemption, but one way or the other, we've got to figure out the capital gains part, because I can guarantee you that the capital gains taxes will be paid. And you may be deferring it until the last parent dies and, holding it off as long as you can, but I guarantee the Canada Revenue Agency is going to find a way to get the capital gains, and our job is to ensure that the capital gains tax payment isn't going to be by the kids running the white flag up the flagpole and putting the cottage up for sale and letting somebody else's family move in so they can pay the capital gains taxes on April 30th after the parent has passed. Another important one that flies beneath the radar a little bit because parents often have blind spots, is choosing which child or children will be the next stewards of the cottage. How many of you here have multiple children? How many of you here would hope that more than one child will end up owning the cottage? Okay, well, that's most people. Some statistics, Ipsos Reid did testing back in the 2002 or something. 81% of cottage owners wanted the cottage to stay in the family. 22% predicted that there would be a rift in the family. 11% reported that it had already started. Okay, so that's the reality. I'm here to tell you that's largely not because kids are rotten, but because of inadequate planning, because there are ways to avoid, I almost guarantee there's ways to avoid those rifts, and that's part of what I'll be talking about. But parents who simply say, hey, I've got 3 kids, when I'm dead, everything's going to the 3 kids, I love them all equally, they're all going to own the cottage, that is probably lighting the fuse on a time bomb, because if there's a daughter that lives out in Vancouver, well, you know what, she may love the cottage too, but she may not even get back to Ontario every year, and so for her to be locked into a cottage that she's got to pay 1/3 of all of the taxes and the heat and the hydro and the insurance and the other costs, while if her brothers enjoy the use, 24/7 during the summer, is kind of a friction. Or if one of the children can't afford his or her share, or there's a number of reasons. So you have to be, should I say, critical is the word, you have to be sort of realistic, pragmatic about which child is, or children are going to be the ones, because it doesn't help to get a successful transition where, fine, I'm dead and the capital gains tax is paid and the title is changed over to the 3 kids, if the for sale sign sprouts the next year because the dynamics weren't right with the kids. So that's part of our responsibility. For the clients that work with me, I provide them with a laboriously worked out template of how to choose your children, with different aspects about everything from affordability to motivation to proximity to ability to afford, all of these kinds of things, and because it's hard to analyze your kids the way you can analyze other things. This sort of brings it down, and you end up sort of with a score for a kid, and it's not, am I going to leave it to them or not, but how good a candidate is this particular child at being a cottage owner? And if the score is such, you know, if they're scoring low on the getting along well with others and high on the it's my way or the highway, or if it's I can barely keep, you know, the rent paid on my apartment, much less assume 50% of another residential property, it starts to focus on that issue. So that's an important one. What else? So, if your succession plan, if our succession plan that we work out says, well, you know, we got 3 kids, we love them equally, but the one in Vancouver, for good and valid reasons, isn't going to become a cottage owner, what do we do with that? Is she just excluded entirely? The $500,000 cottage goes to the boys and she gets nothing, and then if there's any money left over at the end of the day after the nursing home is divided 3 ways? Or do we find some ways to compensate? And that's an important aspect of the overall estate planning. The compensation can be financial. It would be typical if, for example, the parents are dealing with things through their will. They say these 2 kids get the cottage, and the one that has chosen not to be involved in cottage ownership gets, you know, something extra, $100,000 a number. They get something, not necessarily related to the fair market value of the cottage divided by the number of children, but something as a token, at least, to adjust for. In addition to that, we can be more flexible in the approach, because we can also say, yes, she's not getting ownership, but we can give her usage rights even after we're gone and it's now in the hands of the other 2 kids. We can embed usage rights in there so that when she does come back from Vancouver, she doesn't need to beg her siblings for an opportunity to visit the cottage. She's entitled to 1 or 2 weeks when she's able to use it. And it unbuckles her from the cost of that. She doesn't pay for that. She's not paying 2 seconds of the total cost of the cottage. But similarly, she doesn't get a right to say, you know, about the repairs or the maintenance or the new dog. So she doesn't get decision making. She doesn't get the financial cost, but she gets included in, and her children, for usage purposes. So there's an example. One of the most critical things that I can tell you about today is if there is going to be multiple ownership of a cottage or shared ownership or overlapping ownership of a cottage, please, please, please get a cottage sharing agreement. Cottage sharing agreement, I'll deal with it more later, but basically it's a contract that provides a structure for overlapping usage. Now, it could be overlapping usage between the parents and their 1 child, but there's a transition going on. Maybe we're doing some things now for capital gains tax purposes, but nevertheless, you know, we don't want to just hand over ownership to the child at this point, so we have a cottage sharing agreement that says, you know, right now maybe the parents will continue to pay the cost, most of the cost of the cottage, but maybe the child will start taking on more responsibility for administrative tasks and maybe some of the physical tasks. And then certainly and classically for the people that put their hands up to say it's our hope, because we have more than 1 child, that there will be more than 1 child sharing ownership of the cottage at some point, then it's absolutely essential that you have a cottage sharing agreement to provide a structure for those kids. How many of your children always agree on everything all the time? Well, same with mine. So I'm here to say you've got nice kids, and 9 times out of 10 issues that arise, they will find a way in which to deal with that issue, and they won't need to have recourse to lawyers and courts and contracts. But whether it's 1 out of 10 or 1 out of 100, I guarantee you that there will be issues that arise during their stewardship, their ownership of the cottage, that are divisive and that are polarizing, and that unless there's a structure on how that's dealt with, can result in that for sale sign. I had one last year. Not a happy situation at all, but there were 3 kids that owned the cottage, all nice kids. This was a multi-generational cottage that was actually built by Grandpa, hand-built by Grandpa, and 2 of the 3 kids, and of course it's on a nice island on a nice lake and it's worth $1 million. And two of the kids said, look, we got, well, actually it wasn't on my mistake, but two of the three kids said, you know, we got so much money wrapped up into this, we should knock down Grandpa's cottage, and we should build a year-round home, and then we can enjoy this, you know, year-round. And one of them, you know, just about fell over, had a heart attack, and went into an epileptic fit, that Grandpa's cottage that he hand-built with its flapping screen doors that let the flies in, you know, could be touched. Well, there aren't compromises there. A cottage sharing agreement at least provides dispute resolutions and ways to approach it and vetoes in certain circumstances and everything. So, okay, and then the last of the 6 steps is fairly funding the cottage expenses where all owners' pockets are not equally deep. So you've got 3 kids, and you know, one of them's doing really well, and one of them's doing fine, and one of them's struggling, right? And if they are just provided with, okay, you're all cottage owners because you all like it and you get along well, there's an inherent imbalance there, because when the cottage expenses, maybe everybody can pay their, you know, 1/3 share of the insurance and 1/3 share of the taxes. But when something big happens, like the septic system blows up and it needs to be fixed and it's $12,000, or maybe you can't have a septic system where the old one used to be and you got to bring in a bunch of fill and put it up there in a pumping station, because you got to be 800 feet back from the waterfront because it's environmentally sensitive, and it's going to cost all this money. And you know, A says that's no problem, I've got that in my back pocket, and B says, well, it's a struggle, but you know, I guess I don't need a new car this year. And one of them says, I can't do it without selling my car, and I need it to get to work. So again, I'm posing the process. There are answers, there are solutions to these things. Okay, parental, so I'm going to start with the financial challenges. I actually don't consider the financial challenges to be the real deal breakers for this. There are solutions to these. The earlier we can get started in the planning process, the easier it is to deal with the financial challenges. But the initial challenges on the parents are, I've already sort of mentioned. You've got this valuable thing on paper, it's worth $600,000. How much income does your cottage provide to you? No, it's not. It sucks money out, doesn't it? It's a negative producing asset. But there's pressure there when the same funds from employment and, you know, anybody here on a pension? Anybody's pension, you know, going up every year, you know? So you get pensions that are, you know, income that's a relatively flat line, and then you've got, you know, the taxes and the insurance and all the other costs that keep going up. So that gap, almost year by year, gets more and more difficult to deal with. So non-income producing asset, how are the ongoing expenses going to be paid? No problem now, maybe a little harder next year. Maybe in 5 years it's going to be very difficult. Maybe in 10 years, without anything else, the cottage is sold because we just can't afford to keep it going. And then of course, everybody's favorite, how are we going to deal with the capital gains taxes? Either in the context of passing the cottage ownership over to the children while we're alive, or at least upon death when Revenue Canada is there to say, oh, sorry that you passed away. And by the way, that cottage that's on paper that's worth $650,000, we're deeming that you've disposed of that at fair market value. We know you don't want to sell it. We know it's going to stay in the family. But nevertheless, just like for tax purposes, just like you sold it for top dollar. Thank you very much. Financial challenge for the children as well. Again, they may love the cottage, but times are tough. My daughter and son-in-law bought a house in Burlington, a nice house. Their mortgage is, I don't know what it was like $300,000. I had a mortgage when I started out too. And yeah, my mortgage was at 11% and theirs was at 3%. But they owe more money than I've ever owed in my life. So your children will not be different. So tying up whatever, 1/3 of a $600,000 cottage, $200,000 tied up in a cottage that costs money week after week and month after month, versus having $200,000 to pay off a mortgage or deal with the grandchildren's university expenses, that type of thing. You know, it's not a no-brainer. It's a difficult thing. So that's a financial challenge for the kids. The affordability of expenses, because those kids will be, they'll be paying for their kids' education, they'll be paying for the kids' hockey games, they'll be paying their own mortgage, they have all these other expenses, and then on top of that is a proportion of the cottage expenses, so that can be a difficulty. And other family priorities. It'd be nice to take a vacation in the middle of winter. It's not much fun at the cottage if you got to chop a hole in the ice and dip a bucket in. You know, but wouldn't it be nice to go to Mexico and have a week at an all-inclusive resort with the drinks brought to you like everybody else in the neighborhood, right? But we have a cottage, and that $4,000 or $5,000 is basically, that's our share of the cottage, so we're going to have to do that. So there's financial challenges for the kids. I told you I was going to talk about capital gains. And here's my opportunity. How do you figure out capital gains taxes? You start with the fair market value of the cottage, whatever you think it might be now. You subtract from that the cost of acquisition of the cottage. So if you bought the cottage, whatever, in 1980 for $100,000, you know that cost. If it's worth $500,000 now, you know that cost. I'm not suggesting you get appraisals at this point. You could use the MPAC assessment for this purpose. Don't try to use it for real tax purposes, but just for planning purposes, you could use that. Or what's probably better is if your neighbors were unable to keep the cottage in their family and it was sold, and you say, well, it's sold for $600,000. And ours is a smaller cottage, but it's a nicer frontage, so ours is about $600,000. But have an estimate of the fair market value. Subtract from that the cost of acquisition. And if you say I inherited it, it didn't cost me anything, don't care, there's a cost base to it. If that happened since 1971, there is a cost base to it. You should find out what that is, because it'll save your butt when it comes for you to do something. If you have to do some historical research on it, so be it. Maybe it's better to do it now rather than later. So that's basically at a $500,000 cottage, fair market value now, less than $100,000 cost of acquisition, $400,000 worth of capital gain. Now, we get to fiddle with that a little bit more too. There's something called capital improvements. So if over the 22 years that I've owned the cottage, I put in a new water system, and I've improved the road, and I've put in a dock, and I've put on a new roof, and things like this. These are capital improvements. And so the value of those helps us too. So let's say over the period of ownership in this cottage, I put in 40 grand worth of capital improvements. So what we start out with then is the fair market value. We have the cost base, which is what you acquired it for, but now we have something called the adjusted cost base. You don't need to know the acronyms, the ACBs, but so you got 100 grand and you put 40 grand into it. Not your own labor, the government says you work for free, but the nails and the bolts and the lumber and what you paid the electrician, that type of thing, brings you up to 140. So what now I'm in trouble. 500 less 140 is 360. Tell me it's 360. And half of that, if you dispose of it, you die, you give it to your kids for absolutely nothing, it doesn't matter. The capital gains, the gross capital gains is the 360. The taxable capital gain, what's included into your income, is 180, and then that's multiplied by your rate of tax. But I guarantee you, if you got $180,000 worth of income added, you're at the top rate of tax, 46.4%. Call it 50%, because I can do that in my head. So $360,000 worth of capital gains, $180,000 brought into income, about $90,000 worth of capital gains tax. So that's how it works. And there's only one magic wand, and that's the principle. There's lots of cool ways to deal with the capital gains taxes, anything from insurance. There's lots of ways. That's where your professionals will help you, is finding ways to fund that capital gains tax issue. And I guarantee, for those of you that are, people say, when's the best time to plan for cottage succession? I say yesterday. Mm-hmm. This may be, 2013 may be the best possible time in your lifetime to transfer ownership of the cottage to the kids, or to start that process. It may be. Out of this group of, 40, it's probably true for at least 4 or 5 people. Many of you won't recognize that until a few years from now. Think, oh, if only in 2013 I've done something. So, you know, for example, right now I haven't had a heart attack. And so I could get $100,000 worth of insurance like that. But 2 years from now, after I've had a heart attack, I won't be able to get life insurance, so I can't deal with the capital gains tax, or at least not that way. Darn it, I've had a bad year with the stock market, I've lost a pile of money, but that's a capital loss. I could zip out 31% of the cottage ownership to the kids now. That will trigger capital gains taxes, offset by, guess what, exactly the same amount of I've got a capital loss. And now I've dealt with 1/3 of the capital gains taxes for my lifetime. Okay? But if you don't do it in that year, you lose the opportunity. So you look at it now. Simply because you get your succession plan now doesn't mean you implement it now. Today, the lovely succession plan, which was keep it in Grandpa's name as long as possible and keep them going as long as possible, because he's already sold his other property, and so this is now a principal residence, and the capital gains is locked in at its value as of 2008 when he sold his house, and now it can double and triple and quadruple, and it's completely exempt because from this point on, doesn't mean there's no capital gains, but from this point on it's completely exempt. So principal residence exemption and creative use of the principal residence exemption. So there's the financial challenges, and they're fun to play with, and there's different solutions for them, and financial planners can help. And you know what? Things like charitable donations are an excellent way to kill two birds with one stone. You give a nice charitable donation to, oh, say your favorite university, and then you create some room for your, to do something with your cottage, nibble away at some capital gains taxes, for example. Is that right, Trent? To me, though, honestly, the bigger challenges are the family challenges. There will be solutions to the financial ones. They may be easy solutions, they may be difficult solutions, they may be ones that you can just deal with by writing a check. It may be ones where the family has to contribute, you know, all in some way to help out with it, but there will be solutions to the financial problems. The family ones, I think, are the more difficult ones, and they are the ones that parents most frequently overlook because the kids are nice. They'll get along, they'll make it happen. I call that the ostrich syndrome. You stick your head in the sand and hope everything works out. But I point out that your butt is still in the air to be blown up. So here's the 4 C's. Number 1 I've already touched upon. Well, most of these in some ways. Choosing children. Simply doing the no-brainer thing of, I got 3 kids, it's going to do all 3 kids, that is literally a no-brainer. You're not using your brain, it may not work, you may well be lighting the fuse on a time bomb, and the time bomb will blow up in the kids' faces, not yours. So that's not fair. Compensation, I've already touched upon that. If there is multiple children and one of them or more is not going to become a cottage owner, how do we fairly deal with that child? Simply giving the cottage to 2 kids and leaving the other one out, saying, well, you had your chance, you could have been in there if you want, that's not going to be considered to be fair by the one that's left out, and he or she may be somewhat resentful, and equally, the ones that have the lovely cottage are maybe going to feel a little guilty too. And so you got resentment on one side and guilt on the other, and how likely is that going to be for a happy family going forward? So we work out a fair compensation. Coping with financial differences, there's ways to deal with that. That's the classic one that I said, you know, somebody that's really well off and somebody that can do fine and somebody else that's struggling. And they're all confronted with putting in $4,000 towards the $12,000 septic system. How do we deal with that? There are answers, but things you need to focus on. Your family might not deal with that particular one. Your family might say, hey, every one of my children is a tenured university professor, and coming up with $4,000 is not going to be a problem. Or otherwise. But it's something that needs to be addressed, even if it's to say, we've looked at it and we've decided that in our particular family we've dealt with it. Or it won't be an issue, or it is an issue, we have to deal with it, and there are a variety of ways to deal with that. And then the co-ownership concerns, which is, again, I've alluded to, not all children agree on everything all the time, and so that's just going to lead me to the cottage sharing agreement, which is one of my, peeves isn't the right word, but certainly one of the most important things that you can do, and people often think that it won't be necessary, and then it turns out that it really was necessary, but by then it's too late because the family harmony is destroyed in the for sale signs are spread. And, you know, coming back to that, but it doesn't mean the kids are bad, right? One of the saddest examples that I had was 2 years ago, Muskoka Cottage. You've seen them on postcards. It's got these stairs that are leading like this all the way down a cliff edge to the cottage, and then up at the top is this beautiful green cottage all nestled in the forest worth $1.2 million. 3 kids, 2 brothers and a sister that owned it, inherited it from their parents. And I told them to get a cottage sharing agreement, and he said it's not necessary. And then the daughter got multiple sclerosis. And she couldn't continue on with her job. And she was under financial pressure. And there was really no way she could be accommodated at the cottage. So she wanted out. And so she said to her brothers, you know, can you please buy me out of my share of the cottage? I really need the money and I can't use the cottage. And the brothers, who were nice boys, said, you know, we don't have $400,000. So no. Tell you what, we'll not happily, but we will pay your share of expenses. We'll relieve you of the expenses. But no, we aren't going to pay you $400,000. And they had other reasons too, like, you know, this is mom and dad wanted the cottage to stay in the family, and the whole purpose was that we wouldn't have to pay for it. And it would be difficult if we have to put $200,000 on our mortgages on our houses as we're facing retirement. So it's a, you know, it's a complicated question. But it's not a happy family. I guarantee it's not a happy family. Had there been a cottage sharing agreement, there would be ways to resolve this. So what happened with this disappointed young lady, this disappointed woman, is she ended up speaking to a lawyer, not me. And I said, oh, you don't have a legal problem, you just got a family problem. What do you mean? Well, this is in Ontario. There's an act in Ontario, it's called the Partition Act. Any owner can petition the court, and as of right, get a court order to sale of the property that they have an interest in, and then they'll split the proceeds. So, give me a $5,000 retainer, and I guarantee in 2 months we'll have a court order to sell the cottage. Now, who's on the horns of it to lend? You know, so that then back to her, if she does this, suing their siblings, taking the cottage away from them and their children, what would the parents think? Anyway. Cottage agreements are very important, and it's not just because the kids won't get along. Divorces, financial reverses, health issues can all put huge stress on children, and if they're co-owners of cottage, huge stresses on the cottage. What does a cottage agreement do? What is a cottage agreement? It's a contract. It's a legally enforceable contract worked out with a lawyer to cover off a number of important issues. One is passing the torch on. It's a vehicle whereby the ownership of the cottage can pass on to the next generation, but in a structured manner. It has to protect the parents' interests. I'm sure a number of you were alive and well in 1994. Remember the lifetime capital gains tax exemption of $100,000? I did land office business when Mr. Trent took that away and said, this is the last year that you can use it. I had people lined up outside my door wanting to wanting to transfer ownership of the cottage to their kids right now, because they could then use or lose the couple of $100,000 exemption that mom and dad had between them. And I said, okay, great idea, let's do it. As soon as we've got a cottage agreement, you know, we're good to go. Won't cost much to do the deed. Won't cost you much to do the taxes. Let's do a cottage sharing agreement. Not necessary. Guess where the lineup is 2 years later of people outside my door saying, the kids are selling the cottage. They'd rather have a swimming pool in their backyard in Toronto. They would rather pay off their mortgage. They'd rather go on trips. You know, we never contemplated when we transferred ownership of the cottage to the children for tax purposes that we wouldn't have a cottage to go to, because that was our vision for retirement. And I said, remember that cottage sharing agreement that I tried to suggest that you do? So protection of the parents' interests is a very important component of the cottage sharing agreement. Providing for the children, of course, right? setting up structures for them. I don't know, do I get into details on this? I do. So I'll skip that. But providing how the structure for the children to share ownership and usage. And very importantly, preserving the cottage for future generations. Fine, your job doesn't end when you pass the torch on to the kids. If a year or 2 or 4 years later it's sold to somebody else. Ideally, it will be there for your grandchildren. Ideally, it will be there for your great-grandchildren because, as mentioned, the cottage that you've got now is probably the only one that's going to be there for generation after generation after generation. Are we having fun yet? So what's contained? What does a cottage agreement contain? Well, one of the most important things that it contains is restrictions on transfer. So one of the restrictions is whoever signs on to that cottage agreement gives up his or her right to apply under the Partition Act for a forced court order sale. It replaces it with something else, an exit strategy, but they give up their right to say, I'm miffed at my brothers, or my finances are in disarray and I want to cash in on the cottage, or whatever it might be. Yes, there's ways to deal with those things in the cottage agreement, but it won't be by saying I'm not getting my way, so I'm going to go to court and I'm going to force a sale. Other restrictions typically almost always are in due course. Yes, I have a 1/3 interest in the cottage, and yes, I may transfer it, but I can only transfer it to family members. I can't transfer it to share it, right? At least not without, for example, a right of first refusal to the other sibs, or whatever it might be. So there will be restrictions on transfer to keep the cottage in the family. Perhaps there'll be restrictions. Most people with a family cottage, if they have a spouse, their will says, on my death, everything goes to the spouse. Well, that's fine, and it goes to the spouse, and then she remarries, and next thing you know, he and all his Yahoo buddies and their jet skis and their children on their motorcycles with the, anyway, you can see where we're going with there. So a cottage sharing agreement might say, you know, kids, nothing wrong. Love my daughter-in-law, and you know, if you pass away first, no problem with her having used it, but don't make her an owner. So your will needs to be amended pursuant to the cottage agreement that says, on death, I leave everything to my spouse except the cottage, which goes to my kids. You know, and subject to some usage rights by the wife. I'm just throwing out sort of examples of these things. How to share usage, very important. Does everybody get, is it a free-for-all? Whoever gets to the cottage first? You know, that would work great for me because in our family cottage, I can be, if I push it, less than 15 minutes from my driveway. You know, my sister would probably have to quit work around noon, get in her car, and hammer her way along the 401 and up to 115. And by that time, you know, I've already got the Barbie going and the margaritas mixed, and oh, sorry, too late. You're in the tent again. So free for all is one way. Typically, what people come up with is periods of exclusive usage. I get it for the first week in July, and I can bring up my friends if I want, and my sister gets it the first week in August, and my brother gets it the last week in July. And during that, and the rest of the time it's common, and you know, we'll work it out, we'll share, and somebody will be in the bunkie and somebody won't. But periods of exclusive usage is usually very appealing to the family members so that they can bring their friends up and their neighbors up and not feel like they're impinging upon their siblings. Dividing up responsibilities is an important thing too. The classic situation is whichever poor sucker of a sibling that thinks that they're well off because they're only 15 minutes from the cottage and can get there first is usually also the one that's fully expected to be up there on the May 24th weekend, up to their waist in the cold water, trying to deal with the foot valve, and in the winter up, you know, shoveling the snow. Oh, I'm not going to come from Toronto to do that. You're only 15 minutes away. And I know you can't get in, but park, it's only a 20-minute hike. Anyway, dividing responsibilities, just as examples, because I'm trying to give positive spins too. So 2 years ago, nice couple of kids, son who was the one that lived closest to the cottage. He was about half an hour away. The daughter was, I don't know, Sarnie or something. She was hours and hours away. And they were, he said, I don't mind doing most of the cottage work. She said, you know, that's not fair. And he said, well, you know, what alternative is there? And so I suggested, and they worked out and were quite happy with, they divvied up the responsibilities. He's basically got the physical responsibilities. But she's got all the administrative ones. She goes shopping for insurance. She makes sure it is insured. She makes sure that they get the right price on the insurance. She appeals the tax assessments when it's reassessed. You know, she pays the municipal taxes. She does all of those kinds of things, which she doesn't mind doing, and she can do quite happily from Sarnia. And he then feels, okay, I don't mind as much going up and getting the water system going, because all winter she's been dealing with these municipal assessments and that type of thing. Allocating expenses. You got 3 owners. How are you going to allocate expenses? I just got to come to 3. You got to look at that. So how are we going to allocate expenses? Is it just equal? Okay, maybe that works. But what if it's the Vancouver daughter who gets to use it maybe for 1 week a year while the others are teachers and they're up using it another 12 weeks a year? Is it fair to her to have that being equal? Maybe not. So maybe we would come up to an allocation of expenses in their cottage sharing agreement that has relationship to like proportionate to usage and so on. Maybe it's affordability. Again, I had a family that just delighted me. 2 sisters and a brother. And the brother was an interesting chap and dearly beloved by his older sisters. And he struggled a little bit with life and wife and former wife and girlfriend and father-in-law and job loss, but a charming chap. But he couldn't afford any. You know, he had alimony payments, he had child support payments, and you know, all sorts of things. He couldn't afford a penny. So their cottage sharing agreement said, you know what, we'll pay. Because we like you, and we want you up here, and we want your kids up here, and we know that you can't, at this point in your life, pay your fair, your equal third, so don't worry, we'll just make it happen. And I thought, you know, talk about cottage and cooperation and kids, and wouldn't their parents just be, you know, so pleased. So, different solutions for different folks. An important one, avoiding adversity. As mentioned, there will be issues that are divisive. There are ones where, you know, the kids are going to figure it out. And most of them probably they can figure out. But there will be issues, I guarantee, there will be issues that arise. Not maybe, absolutely. There will be very divisive issues that arise. And then what happens? Well, it's one of 2 things, or maybe 3 things. Taking the paddles out behind the boathouse and the last child standing, you know, gets his or her way. Maybe not the best solution. Or endless wrangling and unhappiness. Or a cottage agreement that provides dispute resolution. Anything from typically certain things that it's majority rules. The dock needs to be repaired. That's not one that we, you know, it's just unsafe. That's not a debate. It has to be done, just like taxes have to be paid, just like insurance has to be paid. There's no debate on that. We would like to renovate the boathouse to make it nicer. Well, it could be done this year, it could be done next year. When shall we do it? Then that might be majority rules. 2 say let's do it this year, 1 says let's let it wait. Okay, well, decision made, and off we go. And then there could be another level of major decisions like where there's a veto. Like, remember the true example I gave you of knocking down Grandpa's cottage? They had a cottage sharing agreement. And it had a veto for major things like the sale of the cottage and the knocking down of the structure and amending the cottage sharing agreement, so the veto worked. The other 2 are working on her in different ways, and there's brochures that are flowing, but it worked. And they're still all in the family cottage, and they're not mad at each other because everybody had signed on willingly to a thing that said, we get to veto that, so all right, I made my bed and I'll sleep in it, I won't be mad. Disappointed? Not mad. What else does it deal with? Budgeting. You know, it costs money, so we have to set a budget for the cottage. How much is it going to cost? It's going to cost, what, $6,000 for taxes and insurance and a little bit of maintenance, but you know what? That roof is going to need to be repaired, so maybe what we should do is we should kick in another $1,000 in total each year, and we'll try to build up a reserve so that when we finally do, so we're collecting 7, but we're spending 6, and we've got 1,000 this year and 2,000 next year and 3,000, and then we have to put the roof on, and we've got most of it already saved up. So there's an example of that. And the family council, this is a cool thing. encourage people to put this in the cottage agreement. It's simple. It just basically says, we agree that we'll get together at least once a year in the off-season as an ownership group, and we'll talk about stuff. And it could be setting the budget, and it could be allocating the usage. I'm tired of having the first week of July. The mosquitoes are at their worst. I want to move to a different week. All right, you know, we'll do something like that. So, and what projects will we tackle this year, and what projects can we put off till next year, and let's have our votes, and let's go on. And so that's what a family council is. And to me, it's a wonderful thing because it's yet another opportunity for family to get together and cooperate towards a common goal. So I like to see the family councils in the cottage agreements. Okay. Running out of steam here, but I'm almost done. Almost ready for the questions. There's two aspects to cottage succession planning. One aspect is, I'll call that the succession plan. How do you get it from one generation to the next? Do you do it now? Do you do it in stages? Do you do it on death? It's going to cost money. How's that money going to? Where's that money going to come from? How are we going to fund the capital gains taxes? What's doable? What's not doable? We'd like to. It's usually on the financial side. It's a tug of war. If we do the transfer of ownership to the kids now, then we nip the capital gains tax in the bud. Yes, it's going to cost $50,000, but you know, I'm 70 and I fully expect to live till I'm 92. And over that next 22 years, you know what? The cottage value is probably going to triple or quadruple. In fact, some of the statistics I had, I just went to the Halliburton Real Estate Board and I got 2002 and 2012. They tripled. So you think if it's tripling, I can't even do that in my head, but if it triples every 10 years, even if you got a slow year and it only doubles or it even stalls, it's like this incredible number. And if you think that's not true, how many people have had the cottage? Who bought a cottage back in the 70s? How much did you pay for it?
$77,000.
And what do you think, like what's it worth now? Hundreds of thousands of dollars, right? Yeah, you know, so it's quadrupled in that period of time. And I hear that that is not unusual. In fact, it wouldn't surprise me if it had gone up by 8 times in that, because there's lots of ones that could be worth $500,000. It depends on the lake and the frontage and how much money you put into the cottage, but these things can happen. So one of the seesaws that we have is, do we attack the capital gains tax now, pay that $50,000 now, because we hopefully can find a way to deal with the $50,000 now. It's not pleasant, but it's doable now. Whereas if it's 22 years from now, and that $50,000 is $250,000, well, that's a deal breaker. And yes, on paper, the cottage may be worth more, but that doesn't mean there's $250,000 in the kids' pockets to pay for it. And so, okay, government, you win again. Okay. So the seesaw is, do you pay a little bit now or do you pay a lot later? And that's one of the first things we do on a succession plan is to analyze, well, what if we do it now? And is it doable? And yes, $50,000 is a lot of money. And yes, no, you don't have it in your pocket to pay it. Well, you know what? For example, we've been trying to give solutions as well as the problems. Just last summer we did this, and it worked out beautifully because it was $62,000. A $75,000 mortgage was put on a $425,000 cottage. $75,000 mortgage was at 3% interest. I forget how little that cost on a monthly basis for the 5 family members, mom and dad and 3 kids. It was peanuts. And they all contributed toward this cost. It's on a line of credit. They weren't trying to pay the interest back. The expectation was this will bridge us over. 62 grand, we deal with the capital gains taxes. While we're there, we'll put in 10 grand in improvements that everybody wants. And then we'll just coast along. Now you could amortize it off over 10 years and it still wouldn't cost very much. But in this case, the idea was we'll just keep it. We'll keep it at that $75,000. If we have to put the septic system on, it might go up to $82,000. But eventually, after mom and dad pass away, they have a house. The house will be sold for hundreds of thousands of dollars. We'll pay off the line of credit. We've got our free cottage. And that $250,000 of capital gains tax was dealt with 18 years ago for $50,000. Done deal. Okay. Cottage succession plan, how you get it from one level down to the next. what's the time, which kids, all of those kind of issues. To me, that's the cottage succession plan. The other aspect of it is, okay, now it's in the hands of the kids, or it will be. Maybe your cottage succession plan is, it's going to go by way of will. And it's when I passed away, or the last parent passes away, that's when it transfers out to the kids. And 2 out of the 3 kids, because one's in Vancouver, but she's going to get a financial bequest that will do something towards that, plus she's going to have some usage of the cottage. But you need the cottage sharing agreement. Even though I hope I'm going to live for 30 years and the cottage isn't going to go to the kids for 30 years, this is the time to get the cottage agreement. For a number of reasons, one of which is, if the kids can't agree on a cottage agreement now while you're still alive, you better rethink your succession plan, you know, which is, I want it to go to all 3. All 3 say they like it. But one says, I like it as a hotel because mom and dad do all this stuff. Don't expect me to share any responsibilities. And another one says, I'm not going to, you know, I'm the oldest sister and it's got to be my way and I'm not going to go with any majority rules. It never has. You know, I've always twisted arms until it happens. Well, so now you got a reality check. You know, you got 2 kids that say, we will do what it takes to keep the cottage in the family, including we'll negotiate a cottage agreement and we'll play by those rules and we'll compromise. And you got one that says it's my way or the highway. Well, you're going to have a different succession plan, or you're going to have no cottage. It's just going to be sold. So what does the overall cottage succession plan do? It effectively addresses the fundamental financial challenges like capital gains. How is it going to be funded now, later? How are we going to keep it in the family? Maybe the kids are going to start contributing towards the financial costs of keeping it up because mom and dad's, that gap between their incomes and their expenses, so the kids maybe can't do everything, but they can certainly start contributing something towards the cottage. It respects and reflects the family dynamics. This is the slipperiest one, right? But it's got to be addressed, otherwise you're just lighting the fuse on a timeline. And most importantly, what the cottage succession plan is going to do is it is going to provide a firm foundation for that cottage, not just a wish and a hope and keep our fingers crossed and the kids are nice, but a real foundation that makes you very confident that even when I'm dead and gone and I'm not there to twist the arms of the kids or tell them what to do, it's already organized as to how it's going to go to the kids from a financial, from a capital gains tax point of view. The solution to that financial thing has already been dealt with or provided for in some way through insurance, through mortgage, through sale of the home. The kids have already agreed on how they are going to operate the cottage. The kids have already agreed that it will stay in the family, it won't be sold to the rowdy neighbors. All of these things are in place, and then that becomes a foundation in due course for my 3 kids to pass it on to whichever 3 or 6 kids of the grandchildren's generation are willing to step up to the plate and be stewards of the cottage. So all that sounds great. How do we do it? You can dick around endlessly and get, you know, different advice. Well, the neighbor did this and we didn't tell anything. We put our cottage in joint ownership with our kids. We didn't tell the Canada Revenue Agency that we disposed of 50% of the cottage, and so far they haven't shown up to put us in jail, so why don't you guys do it too? But, you know, that's a disposition and that's tax, and if you don't do it, you go to jail. That's tax evasion. And simply say, oh, I didn't know. I'm not going to help. So you can try and do it yourself, and it's a very difficult thing because I hope I've sort of shared with you, you know, some of the nuances, and it can become overwhelming. Oh my gosh, there's so many aspects of it. I think I'll just have a beer and sit in the dark. And that's what, you know, people come up to me after and say, you know, I've been trying to get something organized for 10 years and I just keep running into these stumbling blocks. So it's important to start the process and, you know, get somebody who knows what they're doing to help you with it. Because there are dead ends. And just, you know, what worked for the neighbor, you know, may not work for you. Just like the heart medication your neighbor takes. You wouldn't go into their medicine cabinet and say, oh, I think I'll start taking their pills. Here's how it works with me. So somebody comes to me, and a lot of it with me is done by email. I never even see my clients. It's sort of cool. We gather the critical information. So I'll send out worksheets just by email. Here's a worksheet that deals with the capital gains tax. You tell me what you think the fair market value is. You take your estimate of the capital improvements. You tell me what your cost of acquisition was, and I'll tell you approximately what your capital gains tax type of thing is. And then that will lead into, oh, that's doable now, or no, we're going to leave that till later. That leads us then into timing. Is it possible to do it now? Yes, it is possible. It might need a mortgage. It might, we might have to tighten our belt for a year. We might have to do it. Yes, it's possible. Well, is it desirable? Is that so now we have three options. We can do it now, or we can do it in the will upon death, or we can do it at some future time. And I guess there's another stage, which is we can do it in stages. I can do a third of the cottage now because I got some capital gains. I'll knock that off. That's a freebie. And maybe a couple of years later, I've made some money on the stock market and I've got some profits, and I'll take some of my profits on the stock market or on the inheritance that I got from Aunt Lulu, bless her heart, and I will put that against capital gains, and I'll get another third out to the kids, and work away at it. There's lots of different strategies. So I skipped over the consider the optimal owner-children part, but I've hammered that, I think, lots of times. So typically I will come up with three alternative strategies. Basically timing, now versus later, and a recommended. I think this is the one that works best for you. I'm not making the decisions for them. I'm just clearly saying this one just doesn't work for you, so don't even go down that path. This one is viable, and this one is the one that I think is optimal for you. And with that goes, here's what it would cost, here's what it would cost for legal, here's what it would cost for tax, here's what it would cost for accounting, here's all the things that go along with that. And so maybe that's all I do for people, and we've got this nice document, and they walk away and they say, fine, now we're going to think about it, but at least we now have a path. We know what to avoid, we know what our goal is, we have 2 or 3 different ways to get to that. Maybe it's not the right time to do implementation yet. Maybe we should wait 5 or 6 years till we see, if the son is going to stay in Ontario, or he's going to take a job in Texas, or, all of these kinds of things. That's okay. Implementation is later. And so, in conclusion then, if you want to get started on this stuff, well, frankly, probably your best start is what you've done now. You've actually done some step, not just, scratching your head and, dabbling your toes in the water while you mull over capital gains taxes. You've got started, you're doing something, you're actually looking into it, you're finding out that there is a job of work to be done there, like lots of things related to the cottage, but if you tackle them in the proper way, they are going to get done, and they can get done well. You do need professional help, and I don't mean just a lawyer, although you'll certainly need a lawyer for things like cottage sharing agreement. You'll need a lawyer to do a deed to transfer. You'll need an accountant to do diligence on your tax estimates and expectations. You might need an appraiser, because you can't go with impacts and you can't go with realtors' opinions of value. So you do need to get professional help and get it from people that are experienced in this, not just people that are learning on your file. A very important thing, get the kids involved. This is not top down. This is not me sitting with the 75-year-old grandparents saying, we're going to work out a plan, and then we'll tell the kids what it is, and they will accept it, because if they don't, we'll cut them out of the will. Okay, that sounds attractive, but it doesn't work, because the parents aren't going to be there at the critical time. And so even if the kids were bullied into, signing a cottage agreement, they haven't bought into it, it's not what they want, it's just going to lead to friction and strife. So what you have to do, typically, the parents do need to take the lead on this. The kids will figure it's not necessary, and they'll bumble along quite nicely until an issue arises, and then it's divisive, and it's too late to get an agreement at that point, and the for sale sign comes out. So the parents typically will take the lead on it and work with me, and the accountant will come up with a plan that we think is viable, and then it goes out to the kids. Kids, it's important for all of us that we keep the cottage in the family. It's not going to happen just by, sticking our fingers in the ears and humming loudly. Here is a plan which we think may work. And then the kids can say, well, you know what? We like this too, overall, but, this idea of if I want out, I forfeit my share, and I hit the highway, we kind of like something that's maybe not quite as harsh as that. Okay, well, then here's an alternative. And if you don't like that one, here's another alternative. If you don't like that one, here's another alternative. Until you find a sweet spot where the kids say, okay, we think that's fair, we'll buy into that. We may end up being on the short end of the stick, but we'll live with it because we agreed to it. They buy into it. So getting the kids involved is very, very important. And then finally, get going, as I mentioned. For some of you, 10% of you, 2013 is the optimal, perfect time to do the cottage succession. For others of you, it may be, you know, the last dying breath. But the time to get the plan in place is now. Because if your plan is to do it with your last dying breath, then that may mean getting insurance now, which you can qualify for, but you couldn't, you know, on your second last dying breath. I'm finished talking. And I am now, for anybody that still head isn't reeling with your thoughts, I'm most happy to start answering questions. Yes, ma'am?
We can actually.
I gotta stand over here, go on.
We bought a lot from Peterborough Lumber in 1970.
Did you? And you built an Aladdin
for $2,500.
Nice.
No, it's not much, just in the very spot, and then we put a cottage up a couple of years later.
Yeah.
So, like.
So what's your cost base?
Yes.
It's what you paid for the lot, $2,500, and it's what you paid to put the cottage.
It's not very much. It's $4,000 to put the cottage up, and then another $5,000. So I've got $9,000 and $25,000. I've got $11,000.
Yes.
Do I have to? I don't know what the cottage is worth. Maybe $200,000.
Right.
Do I have to pay capital gains tax on that amount? For
On $189,000?
Yes.
Only if you dispose of the cottage or die. Because that's what triggers the capital gains tax. It's a disposition. So you don't need to pay it today. You don't need to pay it while you're alive. You can defer it till you're dead and it's worth $300,000, but that's when the capital gains tax is going to be.
We did have it evaluated at a certain time for $72,000. So, and that was for, as I understood it, you didn't have to pay any capital gains on that $72,000.
Well, what you may have done back in the midst of time in 1994 was take it. A lot of people got a valuation and then used their freebie capital gains tax exemption and bring the cost base up for tax purposes from the $11,000 that you put into it up to the $72,000. Now, it'd be nice if you could show that.
I've got a paper somewhere.
I'll give you one just little ray of hope there. Revenue Canada knows. And if you can't find your piece of paper, you can go to your accountant and sign authorizing a representative, and they will go out and they'll actually dig out your 1994 tax returns, and there's the schedule that shows what the cost base is.
Thank you very much.
In the back?
This is just a hypothetical question. Our son is in school, but let's say in 10 years when he's out on his own.
Yeah.
But let's say now we go for the shared ownership and we live a cottage agreement. Now let's say because of the economy, in 10 years' time, which is maybe 10, he has all these debts.
Yeah.
And he needs to file for bankruptcy.
Yeah.
But he's got this equity that we've transferred into his name.
Yeah.
Cottage agreement would not protect us as owners.
Well, it gives you a measure of protection, actually. So let's take that through its process. So he's got debts. He goes bankrupt. The trustee in bankruptcy takes over into his shoes. There's an asset. And there's a cottage agreement that's just as binding upon the trustee in bankruptcy as anybody else that says, if it is to be sold, there's an exit strategy that's legally binding that requires it to be bought out at a discounted price over 5 years. Okay? So you can have help there. But the better approach, if you were in my office, would be, there's so many uncertainties with that now. I bet it'll be less. How old's your son?
He's 23.
Right. I bet there'll be a lot fewer uncertainties when he is 44. So what I would say to you would be, if you have those concerns or you're worried about the relationship and the marriage breakdowns and that type of thing, we could transfer ownership into a trust. I love trusts. And that allows you to do the tax thing that you want now. It allows you to keep full control of the cottage for up to 21 years. And then in 21 years, you can say, oh, now everything's safe and hunky-dory, and we can roll it out to him, and we pay no tax at that point, because we paid it 21 years ago. And if he's presented you with grandchildren, you could even say, we could skip over his generation, give it to the grandkids, and then we've skipped a whole generation of capital gains tax. How cool is that? So that's part of the fun, is getting the right solution for the right family. And I agree, at 23, I would not be talking to most people about transferring ownership. You don't know whether, you know, it could be bankruptcy, it could be, are they going to be living in Ontario, is their life going to lead them elsewhere? So it would be premature to give them ownership at this point. Does that help?
Yes. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Can you claim the interest that you had spent purchasing the cottage against the capital gains?
Oh, good question. And one that's actually
Because
beyond...
most people buy a cottage,
And
and
they
they
pay
pay
a
a
mortgage.
horrendous amount of interest. Why can't you use that against your capital gains?
Yeah, and I think the answer to that is no.
A business can.
Yeah.
If I'm running a shop and I buy a machine and I pay interest on it,
And I think, and I completely agree with you. But
it is no. You know that.
yeah,
Now, let's say I buy it as an investment. Let's say I buy a piece of property
Yes.
as an investment.
yeah,
I'm paying interest on that.
yeah,
I'm going to sell it.
yeah,
Can I claim it now?
yeah.
Yes, because the intent is to earn income.
But you know what?
Not for personal use.
You might not get capital gains tax treatment when you sell it.
What's that?
You might not get capital gains tax treatment when you sell it. Ha ha, they got you coming and going. It's a
Why?
business. Because you're in the business of buying and selling a cottage. You pay tax on that as business income. It ain't 50% of the income that comes in that's taxable. It's arguably 100% of the income that comes in. Don't look at me, I don't make up the tax. But that's what happens to people. We all know people, you know, they buy a house and they move into it and they fix it up and then they sell it and they get away with a principal residence exemption. Then they do it again and the government says, oh, gee, you know, 2 houses in 2 years.
Business.
So all I'm saying is, like anything else to do with tax, don't take what the lawyer says. Get somebody that's going to have a CA or some proper initials and have the due diligence. I agree it ain't fair. Should be able to deduct your mortgage interest, but I don't think you can. And this gentleman here, who looks a lot wiser than me, says you can't very definitively, so I believe him.
Now, I know I run this by the accountant. That's why I was just double checking.
Might want to take that offside. Could I pose a follow-up question? 1971, Peter.
Yeah.
Some people in this room, I'm sure, that have owned a cottage since that time.
Yes.
I have clients also done that. You mentioned it earlier on, but you didn't elaborate on the significance. I think some folks that might find that of value.
So what's the significance of December 31st, 1971? That's valuation day. That is when capital gains tax arrived in the Great Dominion of Canada. Up till then, we had no capital gains tax. After that, Pierre Trudeau, in his wisdom, decided that there would be capital gains taxes thereafter. Very similar to the Temporary Income War Tax Act of 1917. So, up till 1971, you could have bought the cottage for $1,000 and it was worth $70,000 in 1971. So that becomes your cost base going from that point forward. If you bought it in 81, it's whatever you paid in 81. If you inherited it in 91, it's whatever the cost, the fair market value was for the estate, because it would have paid taxes at that time.
But if you bought 61, you calculated at 70.
Correct. And in certain circumstances, you can even push it up to 81 or 84, when they took away the principal residence exemption from 2. So if I was clever, if Sherry, if my spouse had the cottage in her name and I had the house in my name, then we could use our principal residence exemption past 71 right up to, I figure it was 81 or 84, but one of those, if you've got all the paperwork on there. Yes, ma'am.
First of all, thank you for the information tonight. The cottage agreement has been very helpful. We've been thinking about this for a number of years, involving our kids in the conversation, so this is reinforcing that. My question is, our cottage is in the United States.
Yes.
So
what
and we
applies?
are dealing with the
Capital
lawyers
gains
there.
tax still applies. Cottage sharing agreement still applies.
Capital gains tax, even if we are planning trust?
Capital gains tax still applies. The U.S. has capital gains taxes. You don't
Right,
care.
so it would be the state
Your
probably.
cottage is in the States?
Right.
Okay, so I can't help you a whole bunch.
Right.
I can give you the name of my counterpart in the great state of Michigan, whose name is David Fry, cottagelaw.com. He specializes in this, and I can tell you that he and Stuart Hollander and a lot of the other U.S. experts in this area love the LLCs. And that's their preferred technique. And part of that's because, which state are you in?
Maine.
Have you got gift taxes there?
We'll double check.
Okay, because we don't have gifting taxes here. We don't have estate taxes here. We have capital gains tax. I'm not saying we're any happier than you guys are, but there are different things that seems to lead the U.S. residents to LLCs more often than not. Yes, sir.
Peter, we live at the cottage for 8 months of the year.
Yes.
What determines principal residence? What do you have to do?
Okay, so this is one of the cool things about principal residence. It is actually a very flexible definition, and I used to have it memorized, but it is certainly, well, first of all, you don't need to designate a property to be a principal residence. So a cool thing about principal residence is I got a house, I got a cottage, which one is going to grow in value more? It doesn't matter. I don't need to guess. I wait until I dispose of one, then I do valuations, then I go to the accountant who says, if you use your principal residence card on this property, you'll save 50 grand. If you reserve it for the other property, you'll save 100 grand. So which are you going to do? So the principal residence exemption, the principal residence definition is a property in Canada, a residential property in Canada, so it doesn't, your commercial business, your commercial property doesn't count, which is used by you, your spouse, or your family members. It's a little vague on that. It would certainly include common law partners and children and grandchildren. And even if it's like one day, even if it's just used, then it's a principal residence. So it's a very flexible definition. Not flexible as to residential versus non-residential, but what most people do, they're 8 months of the year, or 9 months, or 10 months of the year, they're living in their condo in Toronto, and then they have a couple of glorious months at the cottage, principal residence. And if they don't go for a year, but their kids use it, still principal residence. So, if you really care about this, email me, and I'll email you back the handout that I have on the definition of principal residence. Anybody here that wants more information, you've got my stuff, it's got my, does it have my, was I clever enough to put my email address on? I just put the website on it.
Is it?
This one has my email address, so anybody that wants, more information or stuff like that, you can email me and I'll email you back. And here's the calculating capital gains tax worksheet, or here's the definition of principal residence, that type of thing. I'll be happy to help because it's important. Yes.
Do you try to plan beyond the immediate generation? I have one son with no grandchildren, will have no grandchildren, another son with grandchildren. So do you try to account for that in your plan?
You want to, so the answer is yes and no. Yes, you have to come up with a plan that provides for the flexibility that can go on to grandchildren. But no, we don't try to control now what's going to happen after we're dead. So you provide a plan that includes, like a cottage sharing agreement that says, yes, it can be transferred, but only within the family. But if there is no appropriate family members that are interested in the cottage, well, then of course it can be sold. I don't know if I'm helping you with that, but it is a yes and no. It's a mistake to try to plan out several generations and think that what we think is cool in 2013 will actually translate into 2063, because it won't. But you have to have flexibility and various doors available in your structure,
yes,
so the kids can go out the front door, the back door, the side door, or up the chimney if they have.
Because in 20 years from now, those grandchildren are in their 30s,
yeah,
and want to use the cottage, and the other couple is 60, and
yeah,
and then there's their children. Okay, good. So it could get complicated.
It is complicated, but remember that it's complicated. But remember, for every complication, there are 3 or 4 solutions. And your My job is to come up with 3 or 4 solutions, and yours is to pick the most attractive one or the least damaging one. Yes.
Peter, one quick question. I'm thinking on that line too. We pay capital gains when we give it to our 2 sons. Now, what about when they want to turn it over to their children? Do they pay again?
You bet.
Oh, that's terrible.
Unless it's principal residence or unless we use trusts. I mean, there are things. The capital gains clock keeps ticking. It just, you know, they just love it. You know, that's why. In fairness, you know, it started at a 75% inclusion rate, and then it was dropped by Paul Barton to 66%, and then somebody else dropped it to 50%. But there's never been any talk about doing away with capital gains or giving freebies other than the principal residence exemption, which is quite a powerful one, actually, more so than people think.
You've been very helpful. This has answered a lot of questions. Thank you so much.
Building our cottage, tremendous amount of work has been done by 4 sons and a grandchild.
Yeah. Free labor.
Pardon?
Free labor.
Free labor.
Which counts for absolutely nothing in the government's eyes. Period.
Not even your gas.
It is completely valueless.
How do they estimate the costs if all went free?
You've got your lumber receipts. You've got your hardware receipts. Those count.
Yeah.
The endless hours that your family put into nailing the shingles onto the roof and stuff is valueless as far as the government's concerned. You know, I don't make them up. This is the way it is. I know. If you hired somebody to do it and paid them $1,000, you'd have $1,000 to write off against taxes, but you didn't. And people don't, and that's just the way they stack the deck. Yes, ma'am, back.
I think I probably know the answer to this. But what happens if we plan all of this and pay the capital gains now, and then the economy tanks?
Yeah.
And property values drop, so the cottages that are now worth $600,000 in the future are worth $100,000.
Yeah.
We won't get the money back, will we? No.
You won't get the money back. You're quite right. You've established a very high base, and when it gets back to that, you know, you're already there. But you're right. You know, they've got it, and they won't give it back. Yes, sir.
Question. My spouse and I are separating, and she would have to pay capital gains if I keep the cottage.
Oh, I bet she won't. Not if she has a lawyer. So the answer is, this will be part of your separation agreement, and it will, just like, you know, debts and who gets what debts and that type of thing, it will be part of the negotiation. I will tell you that, so I guess there's a house and a cottage and that type of thing. I don't think there's going to be capital gains taxes paid. You're going to retain the cottage, hopefully.
Okay.
So it won't be disposed of. It will be dealt with in some way in your agreement, and even if you have a lawyer, the lawyer will say, yeah, it's a $300,000 cottage, but there's a $75,000 capital gains tax that goes along with it. Will you please, you know, while we're doing the equalization of net family property, acknowledge that that's not $300,000, that's $225,000 after tax? I'm not saying no, but, you know, it's part of the negotiation. But the main thing is, I don't think from what you're telling me, capital gains tax is going to be paid at this point. It's not until you dispose of it, like give it to your kids, sell it, die.
Okay, but my original capital cost, I guess, would, right now I own 50% of that, right?
Yeah.
But I then own 100%?
Yeah.
As to what okay, that'd be different.
Yeah, you get 100% of the capital base, and, you know, my prediction is you probably get 100% of the capital gains tax liability on it.
Yes, right.
Not being cynical. Been there and done that. Yeah. Yes.
I've been struggling with my siblings with this situation for many years, and finally I think people are going to sit down. But two of the things that I heard about over the years that we could do, we're a very large family, it's now in the hands of 4 of us, and it's going to go into several many more hands. Was one a corporation and 2 a trust? Do you have any thoughts on either of those being better than the others?
There's 1, 2, 3, 4 ways. So succession, passing on. There's at least 4 ways. One is direct ownership, you do a deed, the kids get it. 2 is you transfer ownership to a Business Corporations Act corporation. 3 is you transfer it to a Corporations Act nonprofit corporation. 4 is you transfer it to a trust. So part of the succession planning process is, it's all going to be the same capital gains tax. You're going to have already figured out which kids. What's the vehicle? I mentioned for this chap with his 20-something, I thought a trust would be good. So each of the vehicles has their own advantages. One thing about a corporation is it's got limited liability, right? So if somebody, I don't know what, becomes a quadriplegic while jumping off the diving board that we really should have replaced last year, and they sue for $16 million because they're going to be quadriplegic for the rest of your life, all the owners don't go bankrupt because there's limited liability that's owned by a cottage. So there's an example of where the LLC would work. The trust, one of the advantages is getting flexibility to defer decision-making and defer taxes and keep control. Non-profit corporation, if you transfer it to that, you can make it like a golf club. There's a way in which you can avoid capital gains taxes, unless they take that one away from us. But if it's a non-profit organization like a golf club, it will continue to go up on value. The members are designed to be your family members. They don't own it. They're members of the association. They have usage rights. So there's lots of different ways. So I can't tell you what's the best way. It depends on you, your family, your intentions, how many members there are in the family, that type of thing. But there will be, of the 4, there will be a way that does not work for your family. There will be one that probably works best, and there's another couple of alternatives. Yes?
If I'm redoing my will,
yes,
which I am,
good for you.
What is there any of this that needs to go in my will?
Yes.
Okay.
Good question. Thank you. First of all, you need to have a cottage succession plan. And for example, if your cottage succession plan is, I will pass on the cottage to my kids in my will, because that's what works for me, then you need to have a bequesting provision in your will that says these 2 children get the cottage and this child gets some kind of a financial compensation. And you might want to include something else in the will, like a cottage trust that says this is something that equalizes the playing field. So I got my high school principal son, and I've got my daughter who's a starving artist, and they both love the cottage and they both want to have it, but they're not playing from an equal financial field. So in my will, I might provide a cottage trust that says, here's 40 grand that is put into a trust, just with the kids being the trustees, and it's to be used exclusively for cottage purposes. And as it ticks along and produces a couple $1,000s worth of income each year, well, that money can go to defray the cost of the taxes and the insurance. But the main purpose is when the septic system blows up, one kid has $8,000 and the other one doesn't have a hope. There's that 40 grand, and you dip down into it and you pay that bill, and it's not an issue, and then maybe you build it up again over the next few years. So I'm not saying that your will, if your cottage succession plan is going to be, as soon as I possibly can, I'm going to transfer ownership to the kids, pay the capital gains tax, get a cottage sharing agreement, I'm done with it, then your will wouldn't reflect anything, unless you still wanted to put in a cottage trust to help the kids out later. So, as Sherry will acknowledge, the estate planning is big. It includes lots of different things. The cottage part may be critically, your will may be critical to your cottage thing, or it may be absolutely nothing because you've already dealt with it during your life. So anybody over here? Oh, yes.
Well, I just about the trust again. I've heard about that if you have it in trust, every 21 years it's deemed as being resold, and I don't quite understand that. That's just what I...
Well, you actually are hearing clever things. After 21 years, there's a choice to be made. Choice 1 is the kids are growing up. There's 4 kids. They're in their 40s. These 2 are the ones that are going to be the cottage owners. So you can distribute the cottage from the trust to those 2, or 4, or 1, or whatever, but out to the beneficiaries and pay no tax at all. Or you can say, I like this trust and I want to keep this trust and I don't have any of these kids that are going to be cottage owners, and so I'll reset the clock, I'll pay the capital gains tax after 21 years. I don't know anybody that does that. But the idea is it buys up to 21 years. It could be 12 years. You know, you got a 32-year-old and he's perfectly ready to do it. Pull the plug on the trust, out it goes to him, no tax at all. So it would be an unusual plan that involves having to pay the tax at 21 years. But if you've got a plan like that, so what? You got 21 years to get ready for it. It's not like it's all a surprise all of a sudden. Oh, I owe the capital gains tax. You know all the way. So you get your insurance, or you save up your money, or you do generate your capital losses, or whatever it might be.
If you pass it on to, after 21 years, to the beneficiaries, must it be to all the beneficiaries?
No. Well, not if you've got a decent trust agreement. Typically what you'll have is one that defines a class of potential beneficiaries. Your children, your grandchildren, your great-grandchildren, right? So an open-ended, you know, could be, you got 3 kids now, and that pool could be 12 people or 15 people. Any one of those you can roll it out to.
If one wants out, they can get out, sort of thing?
Well, they're not in. It's just hanging over them like a cloud. I'm a potential beneficiary, but until their name goes on a deed, they're not owners. If they go bankrupt, it doesn't matter. They don't own it. If they get separated or divorced, this is for the people who are not too sure about that darn son-in-law, put it in a trust. Doesn't matter. She can go bankrupt. She can be divorced 3 times. It won't affect the cottage because it's not owned by her. She's only a potential beneficiary.
The potential, so the owner of the trust, or the leader of the trust, can choose from the beneficiaries at that time, and then still capital gains don't pass on.
That's correct. And that's one of the very cool parts. I mean, there's lots of cool parts about the trust. Exempting it from, or deferring the capital gains taxes, being exempt from bankruptcies and financial reverses and divorces. That's all cool stuff. But the coolest part is I don't know right now which of my 4 kids or which of my 6 grandkids are going to be the cottage stewards. I'll probably know in 20 years, so I'll do the tax thing now while I can, and then sometime in the next 21 years, I'll come up with the best solution. And of the 15 potentials, here's the 2 that are still in Canada, still love the cottage, and are prepared to take on the responsibilities, and out it goes to them at no tax cost.
And give something else to the other one maybe later on.
Right.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yes.
One last question.
Maybe 2.
I'm older than 65.
Yes.
Let's say I have to pay $50,000 in capital gains.
Yes.
And I take $100,000, put it in an RRSP, and take her and I take $7,000 each per year, so that we pay a heck of a lot less capital gains, or money to the government.
There's the germ of truth in that. Obviously, you'd have to have $100,000 worth of room in it, and if you did that, then wouldn't you get? Well, is it only against income? What would be an income in that year? Do you get that much of a capital?
What I'm concerned about is the age of 65. I know there's this age where you can't.
Age 65, it could be done. You can do it up till age 71.
71.
Whether or not you want to do it is a question that I can't answer tonight. There's a lot of factors involved. One added
But that type of thing, whether it's a capital loss or whether it's
it could be done.
Contributing to an RSP, things that offset, things that lower your income, like RSP contributions or capital losses, will offset the capital gain of the cottage.
Well, and as well, to Sherry's benefit, some of the contributions to some
charitable donations. Did we mention those enough?
Just some people. Most of you are thinking of kids or grandkids, but sometimes it might not be. It might be something, and obviously Trent or the Canada Land Trust would be something.
So let me tell you about that one, because I'm just doing one of these right now. I've got people that have a beautiful cottage with 1,000 feet of frontage. Their cottage isn't that much, but beautiful frontage on a lake that they really want to preserve. And there's a lot of capital gains involved, and so in effect what they do is if they sever off the cottage part and keep that in the family, they can donate the rest of the property to a land trust and get a huge tax benefit, which will wipe out the capital gains. And even more importantly for them, there won't be a condo going up next door because it's in a land trust. I do want to let people go. I'm going to stick around. Anybody has other questions, but I know this lady had another question. Then I'm going to turn it back to Sherry, but I'll stay here until you run out of questions.
Okay, one question. We have a piece of property that has a cottage on it that's in derelict, and it's turning.
Yes.
And my mom's in the process of making a decision whether to sell it, property or not. We've considered severing the property for each one of the siblings. Is that something you would recommend? It's an acre and a half long.
I don't know if you could sever it.
Yeah.
If you could sever it, then yes, absolutely, that's maybe the potential for a succession plan. But if you're, I don't know if you get a bill from the severance because they'd say you can't put a septic system in 3/4 of an acre.
Right.
So it may be stillborn because of that. But as far as is that one of the arrows in the quiver, you bet.
It's 6 acres, but
Okay, right, sorry, I thought I heard an acre and a half. If it's 6.
Just the water, sorry. It's 6 acres.
Okay, so then sure, if the township will permit you with the official plan to do a severance, you got a couple of parcels, there certainly would be enough, 3 acres is enough for a septic system. So then you've got more flexibility on what you do. You can sell some, keep some. What you sell, then you've got capital to pay capital gains taxes. Okay, so I'm turning it back to Sherry, but I won't go with that.
Well, I hope everyone now has a very clear plan of how this is going to happen. There's the water there. It's complicated, isn't it? Every situation, like all the questions are great. I really appreciate it. And I have to thank Peter for lifting all those issues that